5 of the absolute worst starting pitchers in baseball last season are going to be good this coming season, and I'm here to tell you how. One of my favorite things to do every offseason is look at a ranking of the worst starting pitchers from the prior year and consider what they might change. Why? Well, because on the list of the top 40 or so worst starters in baseball every year, we run into a few gems in the subsequent season. The most famous recent case is probably Corbin Burnes, who was the worst pitcher in baseball in 2019, only to rattle off a 5-season stretch that puts him number 2 on the list of the most productive pitchers in MLB since 2020. All of these guys I'm about to talk about will not pop in 2025, but I'm confident one of them will, and if we're really lucky, maybe 2. So let's dig into these names, and at the end, I'll throw you some bonus content, including 3 more names that I didn't want to dig into fully, but I still am very curious to see how they perform this coming season. We will not start at the top of this list of terrible starters from last year and open the can of worms that is Bobby Miller. I want to start with a fun one, Justin Verlander. Yeah, it feels like cheating to some extent. Verlander has a crazy track record of success. This was easily the worst season of his career, and some of his ERA indicators, which try to parse out what he can control, suggest he wasn't that bad. But he's about to pitch in his age 42 season, and we're not in search of mediocrity here. I want a good season, 2018-2019 vintage Verlander good. And to achieve that, there is a narrow way through, to quote Paul Atreides. The theory I like most for Verlander is backing off his fastball and curveball, the 2 pitches that he's made his name on. This will force emphasis onto his slider to righties and changeup to lefties, both of which have been better pitches these last 2 years. To righties specifically, I'd stop throwing 50% four seam and push well above the 23% slider that he's already throwing, a simple rebalance of his mix. And versus lefties, you can make him a random number generator, pulling the slider and curveball usage both up above 20% at the expense of his fastball. His fastball is his best strike pitch, so you may be accepting a few more walks with this approach, but his slider has been his best run value pitch versus either handedness of hitter when you combine his last 2 seasons, and his changeup didn't allow a barrel to left-handed hitters last year. To get him to a low 3s ERA kind of good that we want, you need more strikeouts than he's had each of the last 2 seasons, and increasing slider and changeup usage is the target of my approach. I think with his recent struggles, Verlander has to be a bit more accepting of proposed changes. The wild card is how the Giants organization operates with Buster Posey at the top and new pitching coach JP Martinez. Are those conversations more letting Verlander do whatever he wants, throwing a lot of fastball and curveball, the reason that he's going to be a Hall of Famer? Or is it more a conversation that goes, hey, the only way for you to get under a 3.5 ERA is to start throwing your slider and change up more. This might be your last year. Let's make it an amazing one. Those are 2 very different approaches, but I do think they have a large impact on whether Verlander bounces back and is more average or if he finishes off his career with an elite season. Let's go on to another fun one, not a guaranteed starter on a team that has a few solid options and might add another piece. His name is Griffin Canning. What a lot of people missed is that Canning started throwing a sweeper at the end of the year. I got tipped off to this by an individual in another organization, but you can ID this yourself by looking at Canning's slider specs and noticing that all last season, the glove side on this pitch was between 0 and 1.5 inches of movement, and then in his final start, it popped all the way up to 4 inches. This may not seem like a lot, but when you dig into that final start in Texas, you can see there are about 6 to 8 pitches up around 86 to 87 miles per hour with somewhere below 12 inches of sweep, which is nasty for a sweeper pushing into plus territory. When you compare this plot here from that last outing to his prior start or any other start, it's clear he was playing with the pitch. An easy development point here is just to embrace the sweeper that he flashed at the end of last season. I bet he would have more success, but if we're looking for a low 3s ERA reliever or like a 3.5 ERA starter, we gotta go bolder. So what if Canning just stopped throwing his fastball? Maybe 0% usage is crazy, sure, but how about well below the 38% he threw it last year? Maybe 10% or something like that. It's his worst pitch, it gets barreled. I don't fully buy that for a pitcher like him, it's necessary to use that in order to set up other pitches. You just let him embrace the sweeper, and now he's a 3 breaking balls pitcher, one of which, his OG slider, he commands better than his fastball and could probably become his primary strike pitch. If I'm the Mets, I don't really care if Griffin Canning's a 4.4 ERA guy again. What I need him to be is like a 3.5 starter or a high 2s reliever of some kind. I need upside here from him. And the way to do that, I think, is to take a bit more of an aggressive approach in terms of either flipping his mix or just ripping a bunch of sweeper. I like the mix approach, particularly because his command of everything that is not a fastball in his repertoire is really solid. So why not just elevate the usage of all those pitches and push the fastball aside? I really don't think he'd walk as many guys as most people might think by not throwing a fastball almost at all. Our third reclamation project is in the young pitcher still acclimating to MLB category. It's Max Meyer, who I'll be honest is one of my favorite breakout picks this season. I say that because a lot of the good breakout picks are already claimed by other people. I think we have a lot of hive mind in this industry of glomming around certain guys who have big stuff, or you could just project out really strongly based on small samples the last season. So I want to plant my flag on a guy who was objectively terrible last year. And the reason I'm doing it is because I think there's a very obvious tweak here from Max Meyer. Stop throwing your four-seam fastball in favor of another pitch. Meyer cuts his four-seam fastball, so the spin efficiency of that pitch is lower than the average, which is why it has less vertical movement and horizontal movement than most four-seam fastballs. That plus a lack of above-average velocity here causes it to grade out poorly in stuff models. Sometimes these cut shapes can work, but they need to actually cut more or be super hard. Meyer's kind of caught in what I'd call bad shape land, or the dead zone. And he was also just throwing it over the middle of the plate last season, especially to left-handed hitters. I don't really get it, but now the Marlins have turned over a bunch of their pitching department, bringing in 3 pretty pivotal new hires, which I like when trying to ID a pitcher that might make a dramatic change and find success. Now, that tweak from Meyer is backing off his four-seam in favor of a sinker, and for reasons I won't dive into in this video that connect back to seam effects and creating movement through a ball's orientation, the fact that Meyer cuts his fastball and has that low spin efficiency opens him up to being a pretty easy sinker candidate. Meyer did throw a few sinkers last year, and the velocity was slower than his four-seam fastball by more than I would have expected, but the shape looked pretty good, and again, he didn't throw enough sinkers for me to be confident that he wouldn't be able to get to an average sinker shape, which is better than throwing a bad four-seam fastball 35 to 40% of the time. He can still throw that four-seam to lefties, but he's got to get it away from the middle of the plate, and I'm fine with the four-seam to righties away on occasion if there's some benefit to the slider having another weapon sit outer third of the plate versus right-handed hitters. Now, I see this as a low-hanging fruit adjustment, but the reason I like Meyer so much is that for his entire career, he's had an amazing slider. It's a hard bullet shape, and he's just carved up hitters with it his whole life. It grades out really strong in stuff models. He has really good command of it. He's just been trying to figure out the rest of his approach since. And with new voices in the organization, he's got some leeway to be a starting pitcher based on innings and Braxton Garrett going down. I'd be surprised if this is not the season we start to see him put it together. Maybe I'm asking for too big of an improvement here from Meyer by just adding a sinker to his mix, but I really do think that is the unlock for him, especially using it versus righties. You could keep the four-seam there. Maybe you could dabble in sweeper land with him to some extent, but the focus is on the slider, maybe adjusting the changeup. There's peripheral weapons here that you could improve, but adding the sinker is really the main thing for me that will take him to the next level. Now it is time for that can of worms. Bobby Miller. He was a darling entering 2024. I struggled to find a data-inclined analyst that didn't like him, myself included, and we were all very wrong. He was actually the worst starting pitcher in MLB. Now, I hate this answer as the reason for Miller's struggles, but perhaps he was just tipping and the entire season the Dodgers couldn't figure it out, which seems unlikely to me. But otherwise, the only thing you can do with Bobby Miller is just bet on the fact that his stuff is really good based on everything we know about how velocity, shape, release, and everything combined and sum up into our stuff models, and that he will regress in a lot of his peripherals back to the mean. Miller has 5 above average pitches, even though he fell off in velocity from 2023 to 2024, which is the main reason you see a stuff decrease here. His pitches should have performed better. The big thing that hurt him versus righties was his slider location. This pitch has some variance in shape, but he was missing arm side with it a lot back into the zone, which he almost never did in 2023. Versus lefties in 2024, he cut his sinker and slider almost entirely out and went heavy on the changeup. This was probably our best indication that the Dodgers wanted Miller to simplify things and fix whatever was going on mechanically, physically, or mentally. Because even though Miller lives off his changeup to lefties, I generally view them as an organization that prefers diversity of mix, which Miller had more in 2023. But going back to our regression point, Miller's home run per fly ball rate was an insane 27% last year, which will surely come down to average next season, or at least we can just project it that way, even in a park that does allow some slug in the air. Projections right now believe this. They have him for a 4 ERA, basically weighing a lot more of 2023 than last year, and I think that's generally the right approach. I wish I had a more profound answer for you on Bobby Miller. I really think that he's the ultimate Stuff Plus bet, which is essentially saying I will put all my trust in what Stuff Plus thinks of how he creates movement with the baseball and assume that he will be able to get back to what he did in 2023. And if he's going to do that and get to our 3.5 ERA, again, you got to do something more. So doing something more here is just assuming that the strikeouts that he probably left on the table in 23 come back. I would imagine that comes through less arm side miss on the slider to righties and diversity of mix versus lefties. Other than that, I'm kind of throwing my hands up on Bobby Miller. He felt necessary to address because of how many times he kind of popped at the top of this list that I've showed a couple times in this video. Otherwise, he is an enigma, and I'm just assuming that he'll get back to what he did in 23 in 2025. The last guy I'll go with here is one that has been targeted by a pair of sharper organizations in baseball, the Guardians and the Rays. The former actually acquired him for Josh Naylor, and the latter tried to acquire him at last year's deadline, according to a source. It is righty Slade Cecconi. Nothing really stands out about Cecconi apart from that he feels like a decent baseline level of command guy, but when you dig deeper, I think these organizations were interested in his fastball. It has what I would say is big total movement, which is simply just adding together the vertical and horizontal break of a fastball. And when you get a number that is in the 26, 7, 8 area where Cecconi is, you have an above average amount of total movement. You basically only get to big total movement fastballs by spinning the ball really efficiently, which means that majority of your spin when you release the ball with some pronation bias converts into vertical and horizontal movement or Magnus movement overall. Now, we've seen the league be really obsessed with these big vertical break fastballs, etc., but there's some teams that have focused on what I would call total movement fastballs, and you see this a bit in the Rangers organization on the minor league side with Kumar Rocker and Alejandro Rosario, generally slightly lower slot guys who are really efficient with that pronation bias. And I get this is really close to what you'd call a dead zone pitch, which is equal parts vertical and horizontal movement. But the thing I'll point out about the dead zone is that velocity can kind of take you out of it. And that is the case with Rosario and Rocker as well as Cecconi. So with velocity, these guys, despite not being big breaking ball pitchers, can usually find decent sliders. Cecconi's slider grades out well per Stuff Plus, and his changeup was passable too. His fastball just got hammered. He exists in this weird spot where his defining trait is this odd fastball, and yet it really didn't work, so how do we make him good? I view Cecconi as more of a design project, changing multiple things to try and hit a better outcome than his raw projection. I'd be curious about turning his slider into two shapes, one more deathball style downer shape that I hope can stay around 84 to 85 miles per hour, and another more cutter style pitch that would bridge the gap between his 94.5 mile per hour fastball and where his current 85 mile per hour slider sits. With this approach, the curveball he throws can stay in his mix. I just think it'd be reserved for more early count strike throwing. I like his changeup too, but it's just not otherworldly, which kind of surprises me for a guy with some pronation bias. This pitch is a lot slower than his fastball, about 13, 14 miles per hour, and it doesn't separate a ton from a vertical break standpoint. Now, these slow changeups can work, but they usually just induce ground balls, which Cecconi's doesn't do, so maybe he's more of a splitter candidate to throw something in the 86 to 88 mile per hour range instead of around 81 to 83. He also has to back off the middle aggression with his fastball to lefties, which overlaps considerably with where he's expected to give up damage on the pitch. Now, maybe he's just a reliever. The Guardians have a lot of rotation options, but I don't think they would have gone after a guy like this without a solidified plan. And my guess is that it's more of a holistic makeover, which for the most part could render most of his 2024 data useless if he's working with 2 to 3 new offerings and get him into that 3-5 or high 2s reliever that we're looking for to truly be a bad to good pitcher on the breakout side that we've talked about in this video. All right, we've reached the bonus content in this video, which is maybe going to be a bit underwhelming. It's going to be very quick, but I initially had like 8 to 10 names on this list, and I realized that was going to become a pretty long video, so I decided to cut it down to the 5 that I talk about here. And also because the couple guys I'm going to mention right now, I've talked about, I believe, in the past. I'm going to go with Walker Buehler on this list, Graham Ashcraft, and Reed Detmers. Walker's a guy that I think could go cutter sinker versus righties and open up a lot of possibilities in terms of his mix, backing off the four seam. I'm not totally convinced the postseason fastball he flashed is what he's going to show in 2025. Ashcraft, I mentioned before, needs a curveball, really good spin capacity, would help him versus left-handed hitters. Very similar to a guy like Clark Schmidt, who's really developed and expanded his mix out. I'd be surprised if this coming season is not the one that he actually adds a curveball and starts to push a little more away from the tipping problems he's had in the past. And the last guy I mentioned, Reed Detmers, I made a breakout video on him entering the 2023 season. It obviously didn't go that great, but he had an awesome stretch at the beginning of the 2024 season. I have no idea what happened there. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe he just needs to get out of the Angels organization, which I wouldn't be surprised if it happens at some point in the future. Right now, he's probably too much control and upside, so to speak, even in that organization for them to trade him at some bit of the price that he's actually worth in the market. They're probably shooting way over that at the moment. But those are my guys. As always, appreciate you watching, and take care.